August 7, 1944. The fields of Normandy reeked of cordite and death. 2 months after D-Day, the Allied advance had stalled into a grinding nightmare of hedgerows and German steel. And in a command tent near Cannes, Canadian Lieutenant General Guy Simonds stared at a map with burning eyes, his jaw clenched so tight it could crack walnuts. Just hours earlier, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had done what he did best. Not winning battles. Not inspiring troops. But humiliating the men who bled for him. In front of British and American commanders, Montgomery had sneered at Canadian armor performance. Called them hesitant. Unimaginative. Said they lacked the killer instinct needed to break through German lines. The words hung in Simonds' mind like shrapnel. Every syllable a calculated insult. Montgomery, the publicity-hungry prima donna who took credit for other men's victories, had just dismissed the courage of thousands of Canadian soldiers who'd waded through hell since Juno Beach. But Guy Simonds wasn't the type to argue. He wasn't the type to defend himself with words. He was a cold, calculating killer who'd learned his trade in the First World War trenches. And right now, as he studied that map with predatory intensity, he was planning something no army had ever attempted in the history of warfare. He was going to attack at night. With over 200 tanks. Against the most elite, most feared, most fanatical unit in Hitler's entire war machine. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Montgomery wanted imagination? Simonds would show him imagination that would rewrite the tactical manuals. Montgomery wanted a killer instinct? Simonds would unleash a mechanical apocalypse that would make hell itself look like a training exercise. But first he had to convince his staff he wasn't insane. The Canadian Second Corps had been bleeding for weeks trying to take the Falaise Plain. Every attack had been met with withering fire from SS positions that seemed impossible to crack. The Germans held the high ground at Verrières Ridge and Point 122. From those positions, their 88mm guns and Tigers could pick off Allied armor at ranges where return fire was useless. Standard doctrine said you don't attack at night with armor. Tanks can't see. They bunch up. They hit each other. They become confused, disorganized death traps for their crews. Night operations were for infantry, not for 70-ton steel behemoths. But Simonds had seen something others missed. The Germans were brilliant in daylight. Their gunners could hit a moving tank at 2,000 yards. Their defensive positions were mathematically perfect. Their counterattacks were surgically precise. But at night? At night, all that German perfection meant nothing if you couldn't see what was killing you. The plan forming in Simonds' mind was so audacious it bordered on madness. He would launch Operation Totalize under cover of darkness. Not just a probe. Not just a raid. But a massive armored thrust with over 200 tanks, supported by infantry and converted self-propelled guns, driving straight down the Camp-Falaise road like a mechanical battering ram. The key was surprise. Total, overwhelming, psychologically devastating surprise. He called in his staff officers. Young men, most of them with faces aged beyond their years by the things they'd seen. Combat does that. It takes boys and either kills them or turns them into something harder than the armor they command. Gentlemen, Simonds said, his voice carrying the flat calm of absolute conviction. We're going to do something the Germans won't expect. Something they can't counter with conventional tactics. He laid out the plan. His officers stared at him like he'd suggested they sprout wings and fly to Berlin. Night attack. Multiple columns of armor. Navigate by compass bearing and tracer fire. Use bombers to mark the route. Converted priests, self-propelled guns with the main armament removed, to carry infantry directly behind the tanks. Artificial moonlight from searchlights bounced off clouds to provide just enough illumination to move but not enough for German gunners to target effectively. Sir, one major said carefully, with respect, we've never attempted massed armor operations at night. The Germans certainly haven't. There's no doctrine for this. No training manual. If the columns lose cohesion. They won't. Simonds cut him off. His voice could have frozen vodka. Because failure means we sit here for another month bleeding into these hedgerows while Montgomery uses us as a punching bag for his ego. Failure means the 1st SS continues to hold Verrières Ridge and picks apart every daylight attack we launch. Failure is not an option, Major. The room fell silent. These men had seen Simonds work. They'd watched him calculate artillery patterns with the precision of a mathematician and the ruthlessness of a butcher. If he said it would work, they'd follow him into hell itself. And that's exactly where they were going. For 3 days, Simonds prepared Operation Totalize with the detail of a jeweler crafting a diamond. Every unit received specific coordinates. Every tank commander studied compass bearings until they could navigate in their sleep. Every gunner practiced firing on tracer guidance. Every infantry squad learned how to ride inside the claustrophobic steel boxes of converted priests. The plan was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. 4 armored columns would punch through German lines under cover of darkness. Heavy bomber strikes would crater the German positions just before the attack. Artillery would lay down a creeping barrage that the tanks would follow like a moving shield. And the infantry, riding in their makeshift carriers, would deploy immediately to secure objectives before German reserves could counterattack. On paper it was brilliant. In reality, it required split-second timing, perfect navigation, and balls of solid steel. But Simonds had one more psychological weapon. One more element that would turn this attack from a tactical operation into a nightmare the SS would carry to their graves. Sound. He ordered every tank to rev their engines hours before the actual attack. He had trucks drive back and forth behind the lines all night. He created a symphony of mechanical noise that would mask the actual assault until it was too late for the Germans to respond. The Germans, dug in on Verrières Ridge and around point 122, had grown comfortable. Comfortable as death in war. They'd repulsed every Allied attack for weeks. They knew the terrain. They had their fire zones mapped to the meter. Their officers were veteran killers who'd butchered their way from Poland to Normandy. The 1st SS Panzer Division wasn't just elite. They were fanatics who believed in their Führer with religious fervor and fought with a savagery that shocked even hardened Allied veterans. These were the same SS troops who'd murdered Canadian prisoners at Ardennes Abbey, who'd shot surrendering soldiers in cold blood, who'd earned a reputation for refusing to give or accept quarter. And Guy Simonds was about to introduce them to a new kind of hell. August 7th turned to August 8th. Midnight approached. In tank parks across the Canadian sector, crews ran final checks. Loaders stacked ammunition. Gunners cleaned optics they wouldn't be able to use in the darkness. Drivers tested engines that would have to run for hours without stopping. Commanders studied their maps one last time, memorizing every turn, every landmark, every compass bearing that would keep them alive. In the converted priests, infantry sat shoulder to shoulder in the cramped holds. Some prayed. Some wrote last letters home. Some stared at nothing, their minds already in that place soldiers go when they know death is waiting. Simonds stood at his command post, watching reports flow in. Every unit in position. Artillery prepared. Bombers warming up in England. The weather was perfect. Cloud cover thick enough to reflect searchlight illumination but not thick enough to ground the bombers. Montgomery's mocking words echoed in his mind. Hesitant. Unimaginative. Lacking killer instinct. Fine. Let the pompous bastard sit in his headquarters and spin propaganda for the press. Tonight, Canadian armor would write a new chapter in warfare. Tonight, the 1st SS would learn that monsters have nightmares too. At 2,300 hours, the first heavy bombers appeared. Their engines were a distant thunder that grew to a roar. Then the bombs fell. Not the scattered impacts of tactical bombing, but a rolling carpet of high explosives that turned German positions into lunar landscapes. The ground shook like an earthquake. Tons of earth and concrete and human bodies fountained into the night sky. Bunkers collapsed. Communication lines severed. German soldiers who'd felt invincible behind their fortifications suddenly found themselves buried alive or blown apart or simply erased from existence. The bombing lasted an hour. When it stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the noise. And into that silence came the tanks. At midnight, Operation Totalize began. 200 tanks, organized in columns, rolled forward into the darkness. Searchlights behind Allied lines turned the clouds into artificial moonlight, just enough illumination to see the tracer fire marking the route but not enough for German gunners to acquire targets. The lead tanks followed colored tracers fired by specialized teams. Green for the left column. Red for the right. They moved at 10 miles per hour, which felt like light speed when you couldn't see more than 50 yards ahead. Inside the tanks, crews fought their own private battles against fear and claustrophobia. Drivers stared through periscopes that showed nothing but darkness and occasional flashes. Gunners sat useless, their weapons unable to target what they couldn't see. Commanders stood in their cupolas, trying to navigate by compass and instinct and prayer. Behind them, the converted priests carrying infantry ground forward. The soldiers inside felt every bump, every turn, convinced each moment would be their last. They couldn't see where they were going. Couldn't shoot if attacked. Could only trust that their drivers would get them to the objective alive. The artillery opened up. A creeping barrage that moved forward at the same speed as the tanks. High explosive shells screamed overhead and impacted 100 yards ahead, creating a curtain of steel and fire that suppressed anything in its path. The Germans, still reeling from the bombing, suddenly found themselves facing a nightmare they'd never imagined. Tanks. Hundreds of tanks. Appearing out of darkness like steel demons. Moving through the night with mechanical precision. Emerging from smoke and shadow to crush defensive positions before the defenders could react. An SS officer on Verrier's Ridge grabbed his radio, screaming for artillery support. He gave coordinates. Demanded immediate fire. Got static in return because the bombing had severed communication lines. He ran to his observation post and stared through his optics at a scene from hell. Tank columns stretching into darkness. The flash of Allied guns. The crump of artillery impacts marching forward like giants' footsteps. And everywhere the sound. The grinding, roaring, unstoppable sound of 200 tanks advancing through the night. He grabbed his Panzerfaust and ran toward the nearest Canadian tank. Got 10 yards before a burst of machine gun fire cut him in half. He died without ever seeing the soldier who killed him. All along the German line the same scene repeated. SS troops, among the best soldiers Germany had, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They fired into darkness. Launched Panzerfausts at shadows. Called in artillery that landed on empty ground because the Canadian armor had already moved past. The Canadian tanks crushed bunkers and overran positions with brutal efficiency. They didn't stop to fight. Didn't pause to secure objectives. Just kept rolling forward in massive columns that flattened everything in their path. An SS Panzer Grenadier sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd seen the worst of the war against the Soviets, lay in his foxhole and watched Canadian tanks roll past on both sides. He couldn't shoot. The darkness was too complete. His Panzerfaust needed clear sight of target to be effective. All he could do was press himself into the mud and pray they didn't see him. One tank's tracks passed within a meter of his position. He felt the ground shake. Smelled exhaust and hot metal. Heard the crew talking inside, calm, professional, focused. Then the tank was gone, swallowed by darkness and the sounds of battle. The sergeant waited until the main column passed, then crawled back to German lines. His unit was gone. Scattered. Dead. He found a runner and gasped out a message for headquarters. They're everywhere. Tanks everywhere. We can't stop them. Can't even see them until they're on top of us. The 1st SS Panzer Division, pride of Hitler's Waffen-SS, was being torn apart by an attack that shouldn't have been possible. Their defensive positions so carefully prepared were useless. Their counterattack doctrine, so precisely calibrated for daylight engagement, couldn't function in this darkness. Their elite training, their superior tactics, their fanatical courage, none of it mattered when they couldn't see the enemy killing them. Guy Simonds stood at his command post receiving reports. Phase Line 1 secured. Phase Line 2 breached. Infantry deploying from Priests. Casualties light. The columns maintaining cohesion. Everything working exactly as planned. For the first time in weeks he allowed himself a thin smile. Montgomery wanted imagination. Here was imagination. A tactical innovation that would be studied in military academies for generations. A night attack with massed armor that the textbooks said was impossible. But Simonds knew the hard part was coming. The Germans would recover. The SS didn't panic. Didn't break. They'd regroup, bring up reserves, counterattack with everything they had. The night attack had achieved surprise and broken through the main defensive line. Now came the race to exploit that breakthrough before the Germans sealed the gap. Dawn was hours away. That's when the SS would counterattack. That's when Canadian armor would face Tigers and Panthers in the daylight battle the Germans had prepared for. But for now, in this moment, Canadian tanks owned the night. The infantry deployed from their Priests and immediately began securing objectives. They moved with the precision of veteran units, which they were. These men had fought since D-Day. They'd seen friends die. They'd killed Germans in hedgerows and villages and open fields. They knew their job. Secure the high ground. Dig in. Prepare for counterattack. Hold until relieved. On Verrier's Ridge, Canadian infantry reached the crest just as German survivors were trying to reorganize. The fighting became savage. Close range. Grenades and bayonets and rifle butts. The kind of combat where tactics meant nothing and survival came down to who was faster, who was luckier, who was more willing to do whatever it took to live another minute. A Canadian corporal found himself face to face with an SS trooper in a trench. Both had empty rifles. Both reached for knives at the same instant. They grappled in the mud, trying to kill each other with sharpened steel and bare hands and pure hatred. The corporal got his knife under the German's ribs. Felt it scrape bone. Twisted. The SS trooper gasped and went limp. The corporal shoved him away and collapsed against the trench wall, hands shaking, trying not to think about the fact he'd just killed a man with a knife. Trying not to think about how close he'd come to being the one lying dead in the mud. All along the ridge, similar fights played out. The SS contested every meter. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and still reeling from the shock of the night attack. By 0400 hours, Canadian infantry had secured Verrières Ridge, the high ground that had cost so many lives in previous attacks. The tanks continued to push forward. Some columns had lost cohesion in the darkness. Some had taken wrong turns. Some had hit unsuspected German positions and been forced to fight. But the main thrust had punched through kilometers of German defensive lines in just 4 hours. It was the deepest penetration into German lines in weeks. And the SS were scrambling to respond. At German headquarters, officers stared at maps in disbelief. How had the Canadians penetrated so far so fast? Where had all those tanks come from? How did they navigate in complete darkness? An SS colonel grabbed a phone and started screaming for Panther tanks to counterattack immediately. He wanted those Canadian columns destroyed before they could consolidate. He wanted their breakthrough sealed. He wanted the entire Canadian offensive thrown back to their start lines. But the Panthers were 10 kilometers away. They'd need hours to reach the battle. And by then, Canadian infantry would be dug in on the high ground with anti-tank guns waiting. The colonel slammed down the phone and stared at the map. For the first time since Normandy, he felt something he'd never admit to his subordinates. Fear. Fear that the Canadians had just changed the rules of warfare. Fear that everything the Germans had prepared for was obsolete. Fear that this night attack was just the beginning of something unstoppable. Dawn broke over Normandy like a wound. The first light revealed a landscape transformed. Canadian tanks sat hull down on positions that had been German strongpoints 12 hours earlier. Infantry manned trenches still warm with SS blood. Artillery batteries unlimbered in fields where German guns had dominated just yesterday. And coming up the Canfalaise road, the second wave of the attack began to move. But the Germans weren't finished. The 1st SS Panzer Division, battered but not broken, launched their counterattack at first light. Panther and Tiger tanks emerged from the morning mist like prehistoric monsters. Their guns had range and power advantages that could kill Canadian Shermans from distances where the Shermans couldn't effectively return fire. Their armor was thicker. Their crews were elite veterans who'd been killing Allied tanks since North Africa. On paper it should have been a massacre. German armor should have torn through Canadian positions like a hot knife through butter. But something had changed in those Canadian tankers. They'd broken through the most fortified German positions in Normandy. They'd driven through darkness where one mistake meant death. They'd faced the elite 1st SS and survived. They weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. A Sherman commander spotted a Panther at 800 yards. Too far for a reliable kill with his 75mm gun. Standard doctrine said wait for closer range. But this commander had just driven through hell and wasn't interested in doctrine. He fired. The shell hit the Panther's track. Immobilized it. Before the German crew could react, 2 more Shermans put rounds into the stricken tank's side armor. The Panther exploded in a fountain of flame and black smoke. The tank battle that followed was brutal. Tigers killed Shermans. Shermans killed Panthers. Anti-tank guns on both sides picked off targets of opportunity. The morning air filled with the crack of tank guns and the screams of dying men. But the Canadians had 2 advantages the Germans couldn't counter. Numbers and position. The night attack had put Canadian armor in positions the Germans had never expected to lose. And there were simply more Canadian tanks than the SS could kill fast enough. A Tiger commander watched 3 Shermans burning from his kills. Felt the professional satisfaction of a job well done. Then saw 5 more Shermans cresting the ridge behind them. Realized the Canadians weren't retreating. Weren't withdrawing. Were coming straight at him in numbers that would overwhelm even a Tiger's superiority. He ordered his driver to reverse. To pull back to secondary positions. To regroup. As his Tiger backed away from the ridge, he caught sight of the Canadian tank columns still moving forward and felt something he'd never experienced in his entire career. Doubt. Doubt that the SS could stop this. Doubt that German armor superiority mattered when facing an enemy willing to accept 10-to-1 loss ratios and keep attacking. Doubt that anything could stop the mechanical tide rolling toward Falaise. By noon the SS counterattack had stalled. The Germans had inflicted heavy casualties, over 100 Canadian tanks knocked out or damaged. But they hadn't broken the Canadian advance. Hadn't recaptured the lost ground. Hadn't stopped Operation Totalize. And most importantly, they hadn't broken Canadian morale. Guy Simonds received the casualty reports without flinching. Heavy losses. Heavier than he'd hoped. But acceptable given what they'd accomplished. The breakthrough was real. Verrier's Ridge was secured. The road to Falaise lay open. More importantly, he'd proven something. To his troops. To Montgomery. To himself. Canadian armor could fight with the best. Could innovate. Could break through defenses that conventional tactics couldn't crack. Could face the elite 1st SS Panzer Division and not just survive but win. Simonds drafted his after-action report with cold satisfaction. He listed the ground taken. The enemy casualties inflicted. The tactical innovations that made it possible. And at the bottom, he added one line that wasn't standard military reporting but felt necessary. Canadian armor has demonstrated both imagination and killer instinct in offensive operations. Montgomery would read that. Would understand exactly who it was directed at. Would know that Simonds had answered mockery with results. But Simonds didn't care about Montgomery's opinion anymore. He cared about the men who'd driven through darkness and fear to prove what Canadians could do. The tank crews who'd navigated by compass and prayer. The infantry who'd ridden into battle and converted self-propelled guns. The gunners who'd maintained their creeping barrage with inhuman precision. They were the ones who mattered. They were the ones who'd won. The battle for Falaise continued for another week. The Germans fought with their characteristic skill and determination. The 1st SS Panzer Division extracted a terrible price for every meter of ground. But they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that had learned how to beat them. In Berlin, Hitler received reports of the Canadian breakthrough with rage. He demanded explanations. Wanted to know how elite SS troops had been overwhelmed by what he'd been told were inferior Allied forces. Wanted heads to roll for this failure. But there was no explanation that satisfied him. The truth, that the Canadians had outthought, outfought, and outmaneuvered his best troops, was something he couldn't accept. In the Canadian lines, tankers told stories about the night attack. About driving through darkness with nothing but tracer fire to guide them. About the feeling when they realized they'd punched through German lines that were supposed to be impenetrable. About looking back at dawn and seeing the destruction they'd left in their wake. One tank commander, a sergeant from Toronto who'd been fighting since Sicily, put it simply to a reporter. They said we couldn't do it. Said night attacks with armor were impossible. Said the SS were unbeatable. Well, we did it anyway. And I guess the SS weren't as unbeatable as they thought. The reporter asked him about Guy Simonds. About what it felt like to serve under a commander willing to try something so audacious. The sergeant thought for a moment, then smiled. Simonds doesn't care about glory. Doesn't care about headlines. He cares about winning. And he's willing to risk everything to do it. That's the kind of commander you follow into hell. Because you know he's going to get you out the other side. The tactical innovations of Operation Totalize rippled through Allied armies. Night attacks with armor became part of standard doctrine. The use of converted self-propelled guns as armored personnel carriers led to the development of dedicated infantry fighting vehicles. The coordination of bombing, artillery, and armor became a template for breakthrough operations. But beyond the tactics, Operation Totalize proved something more important. It proved that innovation could overcome superior enemy forces. That courage combined with imagination could break through defenses that brute force couldn't crack. That calculated risk-taking, when executed with precision, could change the course of battles. The 1st SS Panzer Division, bloodied and battered, withdrew toward Falaise. They'd fought hard. They'd extracted a terrible price. But they'd lost. Lost to an enemy they'd underestimated. Lost to tactics they'd never imagined. Lost to soldiers they'd dismissed as inferior. In the weeks that followed, the Falaise pocket closed. German forces trapped inside were systematically destroyed. The 1st SS Panzer Division, once the pride of the Waffen-SS, limped out of Normandy as a shadow of its former strength. And Guy Simonds? He never mentioned Montgomery's mockery again. Never gloated. Never sought public credit for his innovation. He simply moved on to the next battle, the next challenge, the next impossible task that needed solving. But his men knew. They knew that when Montgomery had questioned their courage and imagination, Simonds had answered with the kind of operation that would be studied for generations. They knew that he'd bet everything on their ability to execute an attack that shouldn't have worked. And they knew they'd proven him right. Years later, military historians would analyze Operation Totalize. They'd debate the casualty ratios. Question some of Simonds' tactical decisions. Argue about whether the night attack was brilliant innovation or reckless gamble. But they all agreed on one thing. It worked. Against elite enemy forces in prepared defensive positions, Canadian armor had achieved a breakthrough that conventional tactics couldn't accomplish. They'd done it with courage, skill, and a willingness to try something no one else had attempted. The veterans of Operation Totalize carried those memories for the rest of their lives. The terror of driving through darkness with enemy guns firing from positions you couldn't see. The exhaustion of hours in a tank that could become a tomb at any second. The pride of looking back at dawn and seeing German defenses shattered by their advance. They'd been called hesitant, unimaginative, lacking killer instinct. They'd answered with actions instead of words. Proven themselves in the only way that mattered in war, by winning against impossible odds. And on quiet nights, when the nightmares came and they woke sweating and screaming, they remembered one thing that made it all bearable. They'd driven through hell and come out the other side. They'd faced the best the Germans had and not just survived but triumphed. They'd been mocked and dismissed and underestimated. And then they'd proven everyone wrong in the most devastating way possible. By becoming the monsters that gave nightmares to the 1st SS. The fields of Normandy remember. The broken ground of Verrières Ridge remembers. The road to Falaise remembers. They remember the night when Canadian armor rolled through darkness like mechanical demons. When Guy Simonds answered mockery with innovation. When soldiers dismissed as inferior proved they could fight with the best. History records Operation Totalize as a successful breakthrough operation. Military academies teach it as an example of tactical innovation. Historians debate its significance in the larger context of the Normandy campaign. But for the men who were there, who drove those tanks through darkness and fear, who fought the SS hand-to-hand on Verrières Ridge, who saw friends die and enemies shattered, for them it was something simpler. It was the night they stopped being victims and became hunters. The night they took everything the Germans could throw at them and kept advancing. The night they proved that courage and innovation could overcome any defense. And most importantly, it was the night they answered Montgomery's mockery with the kind of performance that would haunt the 1st SS Panzer Division for the rest of the war. Because when you mock Canadian armor, you better be prepared for the response. And that response came in the form of 200 tanks rolling through darkness, crushing everything in their path, proving that the only thing more dangerous than German elite troops was a Canadian commander with something to prove. Guy Simonds never sought glory. Never demanded recognition. Never made himself the center of attention. But he gave his soldiers something more valuable than medals or headlines. He gave them a victory that no one could deny. A breakthrough that couldn't be dismissed. A tactical innovation that changed warfare. And most importantly, he gave them the chance to prove, in fire and blood and steel, that they were second to none. The 1st SS learned that lesson the hard way. On a dark night in August 1944, they discovered that elite status and fanatical courage weren't enough when facing an enemy who refused to accept defeat. Who innovated instead of following doctrine. Who attacked when conventional wisdom said defense was the only option. And Bernard Montgomery? He never publicly admitted he was wrong. Never apologized for his mockery. Never gave Simonds the credit he deserved. But he read the reports. Saw the results. Watched as Canadian armor became one of the most effective forces in the Allied advance. And maybe, in private moments he'd never admit to anyone, he realized that dismissing brave men who'd proven themselves in combat was a mistake. That mockery was a poor substitute for respect. That Guy Simonds had just taught him a lesson about innovation and courage that all his publicity stunts could never match. The night attack at Totalize wasn't just a battle. It was a statement. A declaration that Canadian forces would not be dismissed or underestimated. That they could innovate and execute operations the enemy couldn't counter. That when pushed, they would push back with devastating effectiveness. For the soldiers who fought there, who drove through darkness and emerged victorious, it became a defining moment. The night they proved to themselves and the world what they were capable of. The night they stopped caring what Montgomery or anyone else thought and simply focused on winning. And when they did, against elite enemy forces, against impossible odds, against conventional wisdom that said what they were attempting couldn't be done, they did it because Guy Simonds believed they could. Because they trusted their commander's vision. Because they were willing to risk everything for a chance to prove they were the best. And on that August night in 1944, driving through darkness toward Falaise, they proved exactly that. Not with words. Not with propaganda. But with steel and fire and unbreakable will. They became the nightmare that elite SS troops saw in their sleep. The mechanical demons that emerged from darkness to crush everything in their path. The proof that innovation and courage could overcome any defense. And most importantly, they became the answer to Montgomery's mockery. An answer written in shattered German defenses and broken SS pride and Canadian tanks sitting triumphant on ground that was supposed to be impossible to take. That's what happens when you mock soldiers who've already proven themselves in blood. When you dismiss men who fought from D-Day through hell and emerged hardened by combat. When you underestimate a commander who's forgotten more about warfare than you'll ever know. You get Operation Totalize. You get a night attack that shouldn't have worked but did. You get Canadian armor rolling through your elite defensive positions like they weren't even there. You get the 1st SS Panzer Division retreating in disorder from soldiers they'd been told were inferior. And you get a lesson that echoes through military history. Never mock the men who do the fighting. Never dismiss innovation because it violates doctrine. And never, ever underestimate what determined soldiers can accomplish when led by a commander who believes in them. Guy Simonds believed. His soldiers delivered. And the SS paid the price for German arrogance in blood and broken steel and shattered defensive lines. That's the real story of Operation Totalize. Not just a battle won or ground taken. But a moment when soldiers who'd been dismissed proved they were equal to any force on earth. When innovation triumphed over superior enemy equipment. When courage and skill and determination rewrote the rules of warfare. The tanks that rolled through darkness that August night carried more than ammunition and fuel. They carried the pride of Canadian forces who'd been mocked once too often. They carried the determination of soldiers who'd seen friends die and wanted payback. They carried the vision of a commander who refused to accept conventional limitations. And when they emerged into dawn, sitting on Verrier's Ridge with German positions shattered behind them, they carried something else. Victory. Total. Undeniable. Impossible to dismiss or explain away. The kind of victory that proves everything worth proving. The kind that silences critics and earns respect from enemies. The kind that gets studied in military academies and remembered in history books. But most importantly, the kind of victory that lets soldiers look at themselves and know without doubt that they measured up when it mattered most. That's what Operation Totalize gave to the men who fought it. Not just tactical success or ground gained, but absolute proof that they could stand with the best and come out on top. And that's something no amount of Montgomery's mockery could ever take away.